WLRN edition 109 in 3, 2, 1.
I was born woman, off my knees I will stand for my liberation. Sisters, rise again. I was born woman, off my knees I will stand for my liberation. Rise and rise again.
Greetings and welcome to the 109th edition of Women's Liberation Radio News for this Thursday, May 1st. This is Mary O'Neill, WLRN's World News Reporter. This will be my last month doing the World News Report until further notice, so I wanted to come on to announce my departure and encourage my listeners and fans out there to write to info@WLRNmedia.com if you are interested in picking up the slack and joining our team as a World News Reporter. No experience is necessary, just the will to learn and good regular internet access. Over the last 2 years, I have been fortunate enough to not only work with some incredible women in WLRN, but also expand my understanding of what women are experiencing, enduring, protesting, and accomplishing around the world. In gathering stories for the news segment, I am constantly amazed at what is not being reported on for global audiences, so it has been an honor sharing these stories with you. The team here at WLRN produces a monthly radio broadcast to break the sound barrier women are blocked by under the status quo rule of men. This blocking of women's discourse we see in all sectors of society, be they conservative, liberal, mainstream, progressive, or radical. The thread that runs through all of American politics, except for separatist feminism, is male dominance and entitlement in all spheres. To start off today's edition, here's yours truly with women's news from around the globe for this Thursday, May 1st, 2025. Women's rights campaigners are drawing attention to Scotland's failure to help women who can't access later-term abortions. Scotland has 14 regional health boards, but none of them provide abortion care after 20 weeks, except in cases of severe fetal abnormality or threat to the mother's life. Therefore, even though in the UK women have the right to access abortion services until 24 weeks, Scottish women must still travel hundreds of miles for proper reproductive health care. Meanwhile, anti-abortion activists, funded by the Texas-based group called 40 Days for Life, have been active across Scotland, and Jenny Minto, the Women's Health Minister for the Scottish Government, said that abortion healthcare has taken much longer than any of us would have wished. In early April, 2 young women, both university students, were found dead in Italy. Stefano Argentino stabbed 22-year-old Sarah Campanella at a bus stop. In the other case, a man named Mark Sampson is being questioned for murdering Ilaria Sula, also 22 years old. Sampson was her ex-boyfriend, and she'd been reported missing since mid-March. She was found dead in some woods outside Rome. The murders of these young women sparked protests across Italian cities. In Italy, there were 113 femicides in 2024 alone, with 99 being committed by relatives, partners, or ex-partners. Rectors at the universities that Sara and Ilaria attended said, "We must no longer stand by and watch femicide incidents," and that students were dismayed by this umpteenth episode of femicide. According to the UN, every 10 minutes a woman is murdered. In Nigeria, it was reported that there were 401 femicides in 2022, but that number is likely much higher because femicide is underreported and normalized. A recent report published by the Center for Democracy and Development details the femicide crisis brewing in Nigeria, where women are perceived as second-class citizens. The rise of online misogyny further promotes the objectification and dehumanization of women and girls. The family of Shaylin McAllister, a member of Horse Lake First Nation and missing for 6 years, hopes that a new billboard campaign in Alberta, Canada will generate leads. Shaylin was only 20 years old when she disappeared on the evening of July 7, 2019. Her 2 children are being raised by their paternal grandparents. Shaylin's mother, Trudy McAllister, said, "I'm hoping one day she might just come walking through this door. Anything. I'm hoping someone will come forward and say something. I wouldn't wish this on anyone." On April 16th, the UK Supreme Court ruled that the definition of a woman is an adult human female after the group For Women Scotland brought the case to the highest court in the land. The reverberations of this ruling are still ricocheting all over the internet and in chambers of law throughout the world. Angela Wild of Wild Women Workshop quickly remarked on social media after the ruling, "Patriarchy, where women have to go to court to know if we exist. Also, we won." Some feminists were jubilant, popping champagne bottles the day the ruling was announced and singing, "Women's rights are human rights" to the tune of Auld Lang Syne. Others, like Lear Keith, remarked on social media, "We got our careers and our lives wrecked for 15 years, and for what? For stating the obvious. Men can't be women. What an utter waste of time this has been, and it's not over, not by a long shot, but this is good news." The overall mood on the For Women Scotland side has been jubilant yet cautious and mindful of the recent past, when men counted as women and could enter women's private spaces demanding to be seen as female. J.K. Rowling summed up the mood the day after the ruling by releasing a photo of herself with whiskey and cigar, saying, "I love it when a plan comes together. #Supreme Court." The original woman had this to say about J.K. Rowling's photo. Rowling, who toasted the court's decision with the exuberance of a woman who has spent years being burned at the Twitter stake, has become something of a reluctant icon for those who dare to speak uncomfortable truths. Her celebratory post, brandishing a whiskey and a cigar like a Bond villain with a keyboard, was interpreted by some as a jubilant middle finger to her critics. But this moment of triumph was not born overnight. It was the culmination of years of vitriol, threats, boycotts, denunciations from actors she once helped make famous. In contrast, trans rights activists have, on the whole, responded like scorned men. One of WLRN's favorites is the sign that went viral in a positive way among TRAs that says, "I love pissin' on Turks." A leader in the trans rights activist movement is a man named India Willoughby on X. He instructed his followers to get synchronized and #P4Me, winking emoji. "Drink plenty of water, everybody. Parliament Square." Reportedly, they followed instructions and urinated on a statue of UK suffrage campaigner Millicent Fawcett, which they also defaced with homophobic graffiti, according to the TERF report from Kara Dansky on April 21st. Meanwhile, the British Parliament conducted a debate about the ruling and how it will be implemented in the various institutions of society on April 22nd. Here is a clip from Minister for Women and Equalities, Bridget Phillipson.
Which brings us to the statement on the For Women Scotland Supreme Court ruling. Minister for Women and Equalities, Bridget Phillipson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With permission, I will now make a statement to update the House on the Supreme Court judgment in the case for Women Scotland Limited versus the Scottish Ministers. This ruling brings welcome clarity and confidence for women and service providers. Single-sex spaces must be protected. And Madam Deputy Speaker, this is personal to me. Before I was elected to this place, I ran a women's refuge in the North East for women and children fleeing domestic violence. I know how important it is, and always was to survivors, to have single-sex spaces based on biology, places of safety after trauma, time in a sanctuary which allowed them therapeutic support, healing from unimaginable male violence and fear.
Christine Jardine, MP, then takes a turn to speak and asks the Minister about the safety of trans women in men's toilets.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement. I, of course, respect the independence of the Supreme Court and the ruling it has made to interpret the law as it stands, as I do the concerns of many women and the fears, the now increased fears, of the LGBT community. And I would ask the Minister, does she think it would be acceptable that we see trans women forced into men's toilets to face goodness knows what sort of aggression, potentially violence there.
The minister replies to the MP, assuring her that she and her colleagues will promote and protect trans rights under the law.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. As she says, I know that she has written to me on this topic. I would be happy to meet with her, or a member of the ministerial team would be happy to meet with her to discuss this further. Where we can agree is that dignity and respect should be for all within our country. That is for women and for trans people too. And trans people should not face discrimination or harassment on the basis of who they are. But I believe it is entirely compatible to ensure that we have a society that treats everyone with dignity and respect, whilst ensuring that single-sex spaces can continue to exist for biological women who require that safety and dignity, particularly following periods of terrible abuse. And I think it is also important that, of course, there are services that are available for trans people in addition, and often it's the case that some of those services are much better provided by those with the specialist knowledge and expertise in order to deliver that provision. I agree this should not be seen as being a conflict, and the ruling from the Supreme Court, whilst being clear about the importance of biological sex, was also at pains to stress that trans people do retain clear protections within law and should be able to live their lives free of harassment and discrimination.
Despite the continuation of the confusing, nonsense terminology used by trans rights activists and proponents in the law, giant strides were made for womankind in the UK last month because of this Supreme Court ruling. During an interview WLRN's Thistle Peterson conducted on April 27th with Jenny Watson, a UK-based lesbian activist, WLRN learned what Miss Watson thinks of the ruling and its impact on lesbians in the UK.
No, it was a fantastic ruling and we're all very, very pleased about it. So basically, before, the law was grey, so men with certificates, they cause legal fear. So venues told me privately, we support you, but we can't afford a legal fight. So we had lots of cancellations happened, not because of disagreement, but because they were scared, basically. So big pub chains, they feared damage to their whole brand if they allowed our female-only events. You know, we weren't disruptive. We just wanted female-only events that exclude men, you know? Mm-hmm. I mean, that should be obvious. Lesbian events should exclude men.
Well, and now under this ruling, is that the case? Are these pubs now going to be able to, without fear, allow you to have events?
Well, this is the thing. So now the law is clear, right? So biological sex, it matters. Certificates, they're meaningless. You know, they don't override it. And venues can legally defend women-only spaces without fear because of this ruling. So that's, a massive victory.
That full interview with Ms. Watson will be aired later this month, so stay tuned to hear all the nitty-gritty details of lesbian activism in the UK when that comes out. I will leave you with the voices of the women gathered in the halls of the Edinburgh Court to celebrate the announcement of this historic ruling for women and girls. This is from skynews.com from April 16th.
Douglas, to see exactly what is happening.
That concludes WLRN's World News segment for Thursday, May 1st. I'm Mary O'Neill. I'd just like to reiterate that sharing the world news with you every month for the past 2 years has been an honor. Happy 9-year anniversary, WLRN. So glad I could be part of this project. And now you can too. My job is open and we would love to hear from you. So share your news stories, announcements, and tips with us by emailing info@wlrnmedia.com and letting us know what's going on. Until we meet again, sisters.
This is Joe Brew, and you are listening to WLRN.
Drink my way, and I will dance for you. Drink my way, and I will sing for you. Ask me out, I'll say yes, for sure. Dress me out, I'll take that golden coat.
That was Soli with her song And Leave. Next up, we'll hear excerpts of an interview Freda did with Andrea Heinz and Sybil Joe about their experiences of commercial sexual exploitation. Andrea and Sybil Joe will also share their personal feminist analyses of the circumstances driving women into prostitution, as well as the needs of women exiting prostitution. Take a listen.
Welcome. Today I have the pleasure of introducing Andrea and Sybil Joe. They are two women who work with the Red Light Exposé. I want to welcome you both. Please introduce yourselves. Let's start with you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Freda. Thank you for having us, and thanks to the entire WLRN network for bringing us on to discuss our project. We really appreciate it. As you said, my name is Andrea Heinz. I am in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and I'm a woman who spent 7 years in my city's licensed and regulated brothel system, as well as doing escort and BDSM. So 7 years in that industry. I've been out for 12 years now. I'm happily married with 3 children, and I work as an activist combating sex work ideology, as well as the demand for paid sexual acts. And I also operate a sex trade offender program, also known as a John School.
I am Sybil Joe. I am an exited woman in the sex trade for about a little over 15 years. I live in the rural Southeast USA. I'm really honored to be on WLRN. I'm honestly a little starstruck because I'll get into my exiting story later, but WLRN had a lot to do with a feminist awakening that really got me out of a deep hole. So I'm honored to be here.
Thank you. Thank you both. Sybil Joe, why don't you tell us a little bit about your personal experience?
So I really have to start at the beginning because, like I said, I come from the rural Southeast. It's real conservative. So I grew up in what I now understand to be, the first time I heard a therapist say like a cult-like environment. I didn't really think of it that way as a kid, but I grew up real fundamentalist Christian, went to a Christian school, very insular, very isolated, very controlled. Everything we know about that kind of environment. And so by the time I was in high school, and college, especially, I went to college and got into gender studies. I was this blossoming feminist, and I saw all of the hypocrisy and inequality around me, and I wanted to do something about it. And when I got into gender studies, this was like in the early aughts, and it had really been taken over. I now understand, like, the only thing that I learned about feminism is not to read the feminists. It was all third wave. It was all about how stripping and consensual sex work can be this liberating. It was just, all of the what now, I guess, really kind of the mainstream idea about sex work. And at the time, it was thought of as avant-garde, I guess, in the early aughts. And I thought, oh yeah, that's brilliant. That fits into my living situation. I was trying to get out of my family, which was, very controlling and abusive. And I thought, this is a way I can pay my own bills. It's very class involved too. It's something that I saw as this is academically approved. So, I grew up learning you can get out of poverty through academics. You can, if you go to college, I was one of the first in my family to go to college. My grandma dropped out of school in 6th grade to pick tobacco. So I really saw academia as a place to figure out how to be free, to liberate my life. Like Andrea was saying earlier, I think when we were talking, this legitimizing, we all kind of got this idea that, oh, this is just work. This is just normal. And it was really, really fed. And I can see now I was fed into this kind of pipeline. And especially I see a lot of the back and forth between the conservatism and the liberalism and how they just funnel women back and forth.
Thank you. Andrea, why don't you tell us just a little bit about your history?
Sure. I always worry whenever people ask me this question, because it's literally, I could write an entire book just about the entry process into prostitution. It reminds me of what my mentor, a woman who heads up an abolitionist organization, or who did head up an abolitionist organization here, said for quite a while to me. She said, there's many pathways in and so few out. And so when I look back at entering prostitution at 22, I think people assume that it's just this one thing that happens, and then all of a sudden you just wake up the next day and you're like, okay, I'm going to do this. But it's really, for everybody that I've ever spoken to, it's a multitude of very tiny little nudges that push you closer and closer to the strip club door or the brothel door. And, I was no different. So I think for me, what's common or maybe was unique then, but isn't now, is that I believe that I represent more of the typical women that are getting into so-called sex work now. So like we know that there's women who obviously are trafficked into this industry, that are victims of childhood sexual abuse, all those types of things. And that's not my story. So we're starting to see a lot more women that come from middle-class families like I did, women that, completed high school on time with decent grades like I did, that had part-time jobs during high school like I did, and still fell privy to what Sybil Joe just said, this ideology of sex work, and that this is okay, this is going to be what liberates you as a woman from, being impoverished and struggling your whole life, and that it's academically vetted and, encouraged. I only ever had those two distinctions of you're either trafficked or you're a sex worker. And because I wasn't trafficked, but I was in need financially, I had $60,000 of debt and also had abusive relationships that had wore down my self-esteem. I only could see myself as a sex worker. And so it was very easy to get sucked into that world. But even just getting into that, I didn't even know actually what I was entering whenever I responded to this ad in the back of a newspaper that told me adult entertainment make $2,000 a week. I had grew up in a small oil patch town, 5 hours in the bush from any real civilization. And I had never seen a brothel. I had never seen street exploitation, nothing. So the only reference point I had was pop culture and the glamorous gentlemen's clubs and these things that would be shown to us in movies. And so whenever I saw this ad, I thought it was serving drinks in some fancy club or something. And I didn't realize until I was actually there for the so-called interview that it was a brothel. And so it it was weird because, you know, it was almost dystopian. Like you're like, I'm not this person, I'm not of this, but then it's so normalized that you feel like, well, maybe I could be that, or I am that, because there's really just this blurring within society that tells us this is the role of women, but it's also very secretive. So we don't actually get that information to make what I believe is informed consent. So at 22 with $60,000 of debt, very low self-esteem, history of abusive relationships, and, you know, no good education, no good paying job, I felt privy to that belief that this was the answer to my problems. That's how I got in at 22, and unfortunately stayed stuck in that mindset for many, many years after.
It sounds like just the financial need was a large aspect for both of you in entering into this sort of exploitative practice. And along with that, Sybil Jo, it sounds like maybe there was also this academic context of presenting this as empowering.
It was sold. You know, I really see it as propaganda. And like I said, especially now, it's all over. Like it's just common, kind of the common parlance. But at the time, it was being pushed. Honestly, like I don't think I would have really thought of it on my own. Like it almost feels like the advertisement was in the university. And then, like Andrea said, the advertisement was also in the back of the phone book. The advertisement was also, I come from kind of a tourist area, so I did see a lot of strip clubs. I did see a lot of massage parlors. I knew that this was, but in my kind of local parlance, that was trashy. That was evil. That was of the devil, right? That's again, that was the two, you know, like she said, you could either be trafficked or be a sex worker. Like where I come from, you could either be a good woman or you could be a Jezebel. The university really gave me the idea. It felt like I was transcending something in my backwards culture, you know, and it was all tied in with the very avant-garde. We were all artists, we were poets, we were theater kids, we were exploring, you know, and now I realize, oh wow, just like they've been doing this to smart women forever, right? You look in the 1920s, if you look just all the way back in history, anytime they want a group of women who are going to be amenable to this kind of behavior, and they create an entire framework for it. You know, and Andrea has said that she doesn't feel comfortable identifying as a survivor. And I understand that. I actually felt that way for a really long time. But something Ellie has said many times that has really finally sunk in is poverty is a pimp. And to me, the abuse in the law, the abuse is the trafficking. To me, the abuse is what happens inside that room. And it's no different than the abuse that goes on in other communities. The left loves to say, oh, well, priests abuse people all the time. And yeah, sure, other men do abuse people all the time. And also these men abuse these women all the time in these rooms. And poverty is the pimp. It doesn't matter to me. And honestly, also, Andrea, somebody else was making money off of you. Somebody was making money. That's what a pimp is. A pimp is somebody who makes money off of your back. The pimps are very, very sophisticated right now. And it's giving a lot of us this idea that we're in charge.
Well, and I want to add something to that. I appreciate you saying that, because I think one thing that we don't realize is that a lot of, at least in my country here in Canada, a lot of cities are licensing this activity, even though we have a Nordic model approach here in Canada, which criminalizes the buyer, the demand, but also makes exempt from prosecution the seller. So it's a partial decrim law. But what we're seeing in Canada, and I think in other countries even that maybe have a Swedish Nordic model, is that the municipalities, the lower level governments are saying, well, we still have to deal with this activity in some kind of way. And so we think it's better to regulate it so that we know what's going on and we're bringing it up into the open. And, you know, we can go in there and talk to the women and do these checks and things like that. But really, a lot of these cities are profiting off of women's sexual exploitation. Like when I look back to being in prostitution in those 7 years, I paid my city in total to be licensed over $10,000 Canadian, which I did the math. That worked out to me having sex with about 41 men for free, to have this bureaucratic visibility stress placed upon me, to be exposed, to have to tell them my name, my address, my phone number, my alias name that I was using, my websites. Like I was tracked and monitored by this paternal system that offered me no safety, basically documented me as a prostitute in a government database, which was incredibly violating. It was incredibly traumatic. And I felt very vulnerable with that. At times, I think even more than I felt with some of the Johns, because I felt like these people have information on me that could ruin my life. This John, I don't tell him my name. He just sees my face and comes and uses my body and then leaves. But the city, these people, they know everything about me. And if there's a leak of this information, like this could be very problematic. And at least in my city, I know that there has been 2 leaks of their database of women that they track in prostitution. And I know this because one of the leaks was my information. So that was really, really traumatic. And I do want to say, Sybil Jo, when you said I wouldn't have thought of it on my own, I feel exactly the same. Like I was really naive to prostitution, that had I not seen that ad in the newspaper, in my mind, really the only understanding of prostitution I had was street exploitation. And I would have been far too terrified to go stand on a street corner knowing that I could be kidnapped and taken out to some field somewhere or, you know, some undisclosed location and be harmed, that I definitely would not have done that. I would have probably, you know, I don't know what I would have done, but I definitely wouldn't have done that. And so I think that when we have these licensing regimes and these normative systems that serve to sanitize this, it tells people you'll be okay, you'll be safe, this system is okay for you. But what that does, I think in their minds, the people who construct these systems, they're well intended. They do it because they want to reduce stigma and they want more access to the women to give them support. But I think what it does is it has this, you know, inadvertent effect of net widening, where it's capturing women like me, who, like I said, never would have had the guts to go just stand on a street corner. But I thought, well, here's a city licensed business that has, you know, a license on the wall, and I'll be amongst these other women, and there's police coming in and checking. But all of these things serve market expansion. And when we realize that harm is inherent to prostitution, once we expand that market, really what we're doing at the end of the day is expanding harm and seeing more women sucked into the system, more women exploited, and of course, more women trafficked to meet that demand from the men.
Thank you. I want to ask you, Andrea, we can start with you, to just share a little bit about how your time working in or experiencing prostitution, how that affected your sense of self, your body, your mental health, your understanding of your agency as a woman, your boundaries, and if there were coping mechanisms that you had to develop during the time that you were doing that.
Yeah, that's another big question that I could write a whole book about. But I did write a paper actually on this, which listeners, if you like to read, I really suggest that you look up this paper I wrote. It's called On Exiting from Commercial Sexual Exploitation.
Yeah, and we can link to that on our webpage.
That'd be great. Thanks. And so I wrote this paper in, I think it was 2020 that it published through Dignity Journal, Dr. Donna Hughes out of Rhode Island. And Dignity Journal is really one of the leading journals that touches on this topic of sexual violence and sexual exploitation. And in that paper, the InStep model, I created a theoretical tool that I think helping professionals or just anyone kind of in this area can use to understand the journey of women like me who were not trafficked, but also in my mind don't meet this definition of what we would constitute a sex worker, which I think, you know, universally is understood to be accepted as women who have equally viable opportunities outside of prostitution. And that's why I really don't think we have a lot of sex workers, because every woman that even says I am a sex worker, when you talk to them, you very soon realize they're not. They are there because they have debt or, you know, prior trauma, and they can't just walk away. But there is a very, 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 very small demographic that can. So I did include 3 levels of definitions of women in prostitution. So one is the trafficked, One is the sex worker. And then the one that I really focus on with this model is called quasi-autonomous. So those are the women that, again, are not trafficked. Nobody's forcing them to be there, but it goes back to what Sybil Joe said. They do have a pimp, de facto pimp, through their poverty or their economic destitution. I consider myself one of those women, a quasi-autonomous woman. And in that paper, I talk about a bell curve. So you start very low, and as you're entering prostitution, like, again, you have low self-esteem, you're in debt, you have all these problems, and now you're looking up towards this uphill climb because you're hearing all these social narratives, all these things that are telling you you're going to make money, it's going to be great, you're going to be self-employed, you're going to have a lot of freedom for your time. And so you start what I call the upward descent or the climb. And that was really true for me. Like, whenever I entered prostitution, I was at a very low point. But very soon after being in prostitution, I had a nervous breakdown. I think it was only a couple months in. That was because I was showing up in the room as Andrea. I hadn't yet started to dissociate. I hadn't learned to create strong boundaries with the commercial sex offenders that were coming and abusing me. So after 2 months, I was telling myself, I can't do this, I'm going to quit. But again, poverty brings you back. And so after, I think, only about a week, I went back and I was completely different. Now I was in this mindset of girl boss, sex worker, I'm going to make this work for me. So for the next 5 years, I really was in that mindset of this is work. I'm owning it. I'm, taking advantage of these men. They're not taking advantage of me. And so I have to say, like, truly for those 5 years, it wasn't terrible in how I internalized it. I mean, it was still terrible. All these terrible things were still happening to me. I was being choked. I was being stalked. I was being, stealthed where they're taking off condoms. I was being secretly filmed and recorded. But in my mind, none of those things were really registering because I had such a strong degree of dissociation that I was applying. So that lasted me for 5 years. I was making good money. I was putting myself in school, getting my education. I bought a new car. I put a down payment on a home. All these things that I was like, I'm winning. But then, as per my model in this paper, you hit the high peak and then you start the descent on the way down. You hit the tipping point and then you start going downhill. And that's where then the dissociation isn't working anymore. You're starting to feel every time that those Johns touch you, it's like razor blades on their fingers cutting through you, not just your skin, but your soul. Like, they have this way of leaching into you. You have nightmares. You can't move beyond the trauma. You start developing addictions, whether that's material addictions, drug addictions. You start having suicide ideation. Like, it just gets so terrible. And so that was, for me, the last 2 years or so that I was in prostitution, was that downward descent. And so at that time, it was a very different experience. And again, I say nothing had changed really. Like, the abuse was there from day one right till the end. But now I couldn't thwart that anymore. It was being soaked in. So I think it had a very different impact, on my body, on my health, on my perceived level of agency. And of course, coping mechanism, I didn't have it anymore at that point. So I really hope people will read that, because I truly believe that really helps to understand how we journey through systems of sexual exploitation and how we rationalize it and then come to believe, or to realize, that it's not what we once believed it to be.
Thank you.
Ellie posted something recently and said, disassociation is not a work skill. It's just not. But we tell little girls, the more you can hurt yourself without feeling it, the better you are. And you can achieve something if you work hard, right? That's that Protestant work ethic I was raised with. I just knew that if I buckled down, I could make this work for me. And that's at the top of that bell curve she's talking about, that girl boss, right? And when you're on top of it, you're on top of it. You have cash in your hand. For me, I didn't make it through school because I was having kids by that time. So for me, it was homeschooling my kids. I wanted to be home with my kids. I could work 1 week out of the month. The rest of the month, like I said, I was like a trad wife. I mean, I was at home. We had chickens. They had this idyllic middle-class childhood with all their middle-class homeschool friends. And I was making that happen. And I kind of told my friends that I went out of town to work at strip clubs because nobody really understands how the sex industry works. And they just bought it because nobody wants to ask questions. But of course, you don't make the kind of money at strip clubs. You have to go further. And that's that little titration. Like she said, you walk in, you don't know Nobody knows. It's all secret. You don't know till you get there. And then once you're there, oh, well, I'll go this far. Okay, well, I can make a little bit more money if I go this far. And again, I'm a good worker. It's not me. I'm doing a job. I'm like an actress. But then, like she said, there reaches a tipping point. Everybody reaches a tipping point because your body can't do that because we're humans. Humans can't do that. When she said the disassociation stops to work at a certain point, I'll never forget. I was in St. Louis in a hotel room with a John, and it just went all over me. And I started crying, and I stopped it, and I got through the appointment, and I called my pimp and I said, I can't do any more calls today. And she said, well, you really owe me money for this airplane ticket because I flew you out there. And I was like, wait a minute. I thought we were sex workers. Like Andrea said, I thought I had autonomy. Now you're telling me I owe you money, and I'm telling you I'm having a panic attack, but it doesn't matter. I have to keep doing it. No, I'm not going to do that. And that was kind of my first attempt at getting out. But like she said, you need money. You got to pay rent. You've got to pay electricity. And I had kids. And so you keep going back and again, you go through this cycle. Okay, well, I'm just burnt out. I need to rest for a few months. And after a few months, well, I can pick up a few appointments. So you started at poverty and low self-esteem, and you ended at addictions and suicide. And then you're in a hole then. Question is, how do we get out?
What was the turning point? We'll start with you, Sybil Jo, that led you to exiting.
So for me, again, I came to it through a funny way. And like I keep mentioning, WLRN had a lot to do with it. It started, a friend of mine, actually, funny enough, it started with the trans debate. A close friend of mine kind of pulled me aside and said, I need to talk to you about this. I'm having some questions about this trans ideology that's happening and the way everybody is talking. I think something else is going on. And she kind of sent me to a few websites, and it got in my head, and I started Googling. And as I was Googling the question of gender ideology, I was coming across radical feminist ideas. I thought of myself as a feminist because, again, I had gone to college and I had learned the right books to read, and the third wave was the new progressive. And don't read don't read Dworkin, don't read Jeffries, don't read any of that. That's really, they're like old prudes, they're like the old conservative. And so I had never been introduced to these ideas, and I just became starving for it. And at that time I had lost my house. I was really at the bottom of that bell curve that Andrea talked about, and couldn't function. I couldn't hold down a regular job. So I was starting to go into a kind of mental health breakdown that I'm getting out of now, about 10 years later. It was a really dark time, and I couldn't make sense of what I was feeling and why I was feeling it. I couldn't put the pieces together. And then when I started reading second wave feminism and radical feminist ideas, and especially Dworkin, she showed me how the pieces fit together, how my conservative childhood, the men who I was trying to, like my paternalistic grandfather who abused all of his daughters, and that I was trying to go to the other side, and how the other side really is the same side, and how it fit together. And honestly, it just got to the point that because once I understood what was happening, I couldn't do it anymore. I was at the bottom of that bell curve, and I couldn't dissociate anymore. And I realized, like, if I have to live in a cardboard box, if I have to be poor, I will have to be poor, because I couldn't make myself get up and go do it.
Well, I think so much of what Sybil Jo just said really resonates with me too. It was discovering radical and socialist feminist ideology, where I had also only ever had exposure to third wave feminist discourse as well. So I think I want to say, I think that's pretty universal for a lot of women, maybe not going the feminist route of reading academia like we did and having an awakening that way. But I think that it's always tied to some kind of awakening. And usually that's through a catalyst of some kind, either a really positive one, like a birth of a child or getting a job opportunity, or a really negative one, like an accumulation of violence, or like one really bad John that scares, the hell out of you. And you think, I almost died there in that room with him. For me, it was luckily, not a major catalyst like that, but it was that, being in college and studying correctional services and reading about violence against women, I had that awakening. But for me, I think it was also other things too. And, I'm always so ashamed whenever I talk about this, but for the last few years that I was in prostitution, I actually owned a licensed and regulated brothel in my city. And the reason why I did that was because we were facing so much abuse in other studios operating under other owners that didn't seem to care about us. And, some of the studios were owned by people who weren't prostituting themselves, so they couldn't appreciate like what Sybil Joe said, like with that escort agency owner, like, we'll just go make the money. They were really outcomes based on the financial level and not looking at us as humans. We were products, and they wanted to generate as much profit as they could off of us. So they didn't respect our boundaries. So I think, in prostitution, there's a very large victim offender overlap when you're looking at the sector of so-called sex work. Because if you're looking at it as a job, every woman wants to climb the quote unquote corporate ladder. You don't want to be the bottom rung worker anymore. You want to have that autonomy. And when you're not seeing that coming to fruition like you think it will, you start pursuing the path that you think will take you there because you're desperate to actually reach that point, like Sybil Joe said, of becoming the sex worker and seeing that fallacy materialize for you. There's an indoor safety myth. You can't make prostitution safe regardless. And then at that point, I really felt like I am a pimp. I am now part of the problem. I had built this life believing that I was a worker and that I was a businesswoman and all of these lies. So that really kept me trapped a lot longer, but also fear, just immense fear and uncertainty that I could make it in the world using something from myself other than my body, because I had not done anything aside from studying in college for 7 years. I had just been prostituting myself for 7 years in these small rooms, in these buildings that, you don't get public interaction. Like the only people that you're seeing are Johns who are coming in to abuse you. And so you're not building any kind of network. You're not creating any kind of community. You're very isolated. You're being abused. You don't feel good about yourself. You're definitely not having your self-esteem and your self-worth improved. So I was thinking differently. I was talking differently than people in society. And I thought, like, how am I ever going to reintegrate into conventional society? I'm not. It was the fear and uncertainty. It was learning about the feminist discourse and having that awakening. And finally, the real final straw for me was two things. It was getting closer than I had ever been to ending my life and just realizing, okay, like Sybil Joe said, if I have to live in a squalor type residence and eat out of the food bank, I will, because if not, the other option is I'm just not going to have a life. I'm going to kill myself. And then really the last push that got me there was falling in love with my now husband. A woman that I did duos with approached me and said, I'll buy out your share of the brothel. And she still owns it to this day. I always say I wish I would have just closed it and filed bankruptcy. So again, many pathways in, very few out. It takes a lot of time and a lot of work to really build a new life that you feel certain that when you leave prostitution, you won't be going back through the revolving door that we see so often.
Thank you both for sharing all of that. What do the women working in prostitution need?
I think there's really three key things that they need. First and foremost is housing. Income obviously is another one, because we know that money is what drives women to prostitution. So I think the income has to be paired with financial literacy as well as job skills training. And then the third one, it's always therapy. Every single one of them, wherever they are on that continuum or mindset of sex work ideology, they all say, I need therapy. And so that to me speaks to how deep the trauma embeds within us, no matter how we perceive our participation in the commercial sex industry. We all understand that it's a very difficult activity to be involved in, and it really does a number on you in an emotional sense, a mental sense, a spiritual sense. And until you can kind of sort through that, which, Sybil Joe said 10 years for her to really kind of go through that healing journey. It's the same for me. It was probably a solid 9 years or so after prostitution that I really kind of felt like I was starting to become a healed version of me and moving forward. So therapy, that's a big one. So housing, therapy, and income support.
Thank you.
You can't start healing when you don't have your basic needs. But when you ask, like, how can you help women to get out of the sex industry, it's the same question. How can you help women to get out of abusive marriages? How can you help women to get out of abusive church communities? Because to me, the sexual violence is all this, it's a continuum. It's we chop it up into these separate sectors, but really, and Andrea, you talked about the self-esteem and just feeling like you aren't good for anything else. That's an effect of sexual abuse, right? Whether that sexual abuse happens in a home, whether it happens in a church, whether it happens in a hotel room, whether it happens someplace fancy or in an alleyway, it affects everybody the same way and really siphons us into these trajectories that are huge. If more women could just talk with one another and realize that it's the same men doing the same behaviors and our bodies are reacting the same ways, and it's creating our lives. It's creating our work life. It's creating our home life. I don't think that we can address one part of it.
Thank you. How do you view that sort of normalizing of exploitative sexual practices in society? Is there anything that we can do about it?
Well, I think it really speaks to how much we've lost the way. Like we had such a strong movement of radical socialist feminist ideology in the late 70s, in the 80s, and it was really surging. And then all of a sudden that was villainized. And I think, in addition to it being villainized, people just started struggling a lot more. That was when we started seeing the rise of neoliberalism and, laissez-faire policies that really took away a lot of collectivism in society and started making everything viewed through a hyper individualistic lens. And that just goes right back to what Sybil Joe said, right? Like we look at the people as the problems on an individual level. Oh, you're having something bad happen to you because you are a bad woman. We're not looking at things through a structural lens, which is what we really need to do, especially when we're looking at what is happening to like an entire half of the population. Like women are 50 to 51% of the population. Like this is not happening in some little micro silo. This is happening all over the world where women's poverty is almost universal, and that we are not those that own property. We are not those that are making good income. We're doing the lion's share of unpaid labor, of care labor, which has become feminized, that is at low wages. Like we really need to have this uprising of women, I think, where we stop trying to fight for what we need as individuals, but actually look at what we need as a collective, like as women together. But I also think too, one thing that we really have to do is we have to target the demand for this activity, because we're shifting. We're always looking at the women. Why is she there? She's there because there is a man with disposable money who is using that money to sexually abuse women and girls because he can. So why are we allowing these systems to stay in place that are allowing men to have extra money to use to do these things when women are so desperate for basic amounts of money that they will go and subject themselves or be subjected to being sexually exploited just to get by and scrimp? That's really what I want to see. Is I want to see a fire in the belly of women, and where we band together and we don't take this anymore, because we can't. This is the way it's going, and it's not going to change unless we do something to change it. But it also does require us getting men on board for them to change their behavior. So we have to really, not only reach the hearts of men through education and awareness, but we also have to hold them criminally accountable. Because if you look at studies, that is what stops men from purchasing sex and sex acts, is that they will be arrested and they will be publicly exposed. So, we've done the education route. We've really worked hard at that, and we're not winning that battle. So now, in my mind, it's time for us to go after them in a legal sense and fine them very severely, and use those fine monies to go forth and fund programs for women and girls and further education to, reach boys at a younger age so that they don't turn out to become commercial sex offenders once they're adults.
Are you referring to specifically the equality model or the Nordic model of criminalizing the buyers and also the pimps? And then your idea is, okay, so we take that money and then we put it into exit support services for women.
Yeah. So that serves two purposes, right? The taxpayer should not be paying for women to be exiting prostitution if they are not part of the problem, in my mind, right? The taxpayers are already struggling as it is to get by in this neoliberal state. I think that those who are causing the problem, the Johns, should be the ones to pony up the money and be paying to fix this problem, or remove themselves from that, and then they don't have to pay to fix it. And I think when we target the demand, we will see market constriction happen because, again, men don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want to lose their families. They don't want to be publicly exposed. And they definitely don't want to be on a commercial sex offender registry. And I really, really think that if we can take those actions, implement the Swedish or Nordic model in every country that we can get it in, have steep fines for these men, and put them on sex offender registries if they are repeat offenders who don't learn after they go through a John School education program, then I think that we would see a drastic reduction in this activity. And then I think that that has the outcome of then changing the face of society where women are not seen to be purchasable commodities, because we would have a much, much smaller and less visible prostitution system. So it would not have that cultural influence that it's carrying now, that we're just seeing ballooning everywhere in the world.
Andrea Dworkin said patriarchy is the practice, porn is the ideology. This is how we spread that, how they spread this ideology of sexual abuse. Why is this spreading so much? And my thought was like, well, yeah, why don't women fight back, right? Why are we seeing this? And I think it's really for the same reason that women often don't fight back. Again, going back to the nitty gritty of what sexual abuse does to a person, to a human organism. And I think the same things that are being done to prostituted women behind closed doors are being done to wives and girlfriends behind those same closed doors. It breaches that divide, and to stand up against that and to call out, I think a lot of women who are going with this sex positive, quote unquote, I call it porn culture, they don't want to call their men out. They know what's happening and it's very painful. And just like that bell curve, I think we might be on a cultural bell curve where we're doing this. Oh, this can be empowering. This can be, this girl boss thing. And I am afraid that we're going to have to reach a cultural tipping point where women can't do it anymore, where we see what's happening to our daughters. We see what's happening to our kids. Yeah, I think the same, like I said, the same things are happening in marriages. The same things are happening in workplaces. These same kinds of abuses. There's going to reach a point for every woman where she can't do it anymore. She can't dissociate. And we use a lot of the same dissociation tactics. I see that happening. I see conversations happening that weren't happening 10 years ago. Certainly weren't happening 20 years ago.
I'd like to give either or both of you an opportunity to talk a little bit about Red Light Exposé, and which is the podcast that you are both involved with along with some other women. And if there are any other specific organizations.
Red Light Exposé was founded in June of 2023. So we're still really in our early years, our early formation of the project. We have 11 women in 7 countries. 8 of us are experiential, and the other 3 who aren't are still very much culturally impacted from sex work ideology, porn culture, like Sybil Joe said, have experienced, some forms of abuse in non-commercialized sexual areas like the BDSM community or kink communities. So really, I kind of consider us all to be experiential to some degree, in that we are a grassroots survivor-led circle. So we don't generate any income for ourselves. All of our money goes to our overhead costs of editing, any graphics type work, our website, compensating our survivor guests that we bring on. So all of the volunteers don't make any income doing the work. We would like to change that, where we can pay all the people involved in the project, like our survivor speakers and hosts. But unfortunately, we're just very much grassroots and struggling. So of course, if any of your listeners would like to make a donation to us, we would be eternally grateful. You can send it our way. We can send it however you like. So if you have an episode in mind that you want us to produce with your donation, we can create an episode on that topic. Or if you really just listened to an episode that you liked and wanted to direct your donation to compensating that host who did the interview, you can do that, and we can send them that money as an honorarium. Yeah, it's just a really wonderful project. We put out an episode about every 2 weeks, and I guess I can be the first to announce this. Your show will be the first that we're ever saying this, but we're doing a summer series this year in 2025 called Men for Equality. And so we're going to be interviewing 8 men who are survivors or advocates in this space, experts, and we'll be airing one episode every week in July, starting July 7th until August 25th. We really want to get more people to understand that there are men that are exploited as well, and that are also helping to change this narrative. And unfortunately, a lot of feminist work is vilified or siloed because, oh, that's women's work, that's a women's issue. But we know that this is actually a men's issue just as much, if not more, than it is a women's issue. So we really want to spend our summer drawing attention to men in this space. And so our website is redlightexposé.com. And then your question about organizations, I mean, an organization that I just love and hold near and dear that I think we all do is Nordic Model Now, which is a UK grassroots feminist collective. But for your listeners, who I'm assuming the most are probably American, I would say Wolf is wonderful, which is Women's Liberation Front. Epic, which is a group of men who actually intercept buyers whenever they are trying to exploit women on the internet. So they put up decoy ads and try to reach these men and have conversations with them. Another one would be Rights for Girls. They're doing some really great work around raising awareness of buyers as well. And finally, I would also say another American organization to look for is Wake Up Brother, which is a new group that is really working to try to spread the Nordic model in different countries throughout the world. Thank you again, Freda, for having us on, and for your team at WLRN, because this is part of the puzzle, right? Is like moving us into the mainstream conversations, because we have seen such a vilification of feminist discourse for many decades now with the rise of this faux feminism, this third wave, that it's really hard. Like, we're clawing our way to the mainstream every day, trying to get people to notice this and to really unpack it, because, you know, I'm sure I speak for all of us in saying that, you know, you don't have an instant awakening. It really takes a lot of time to really understand these issues that are so deeply embedded in society and are so complex, that have so much nuance to them. We have to keep talking about this stuff and get people to have repeated exposure to it, where it moves them eventually from the head space down to the heart space, because then we won't be intellectualizing, we'll actually be caring about it. And that's the point, that we start to actually act on it. So I just want to say thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who listened to this conversation. And
thank you so much. It's been an honor as always. So let's just keep the conversation going.
Well, I want to thank you both so much, Andrea and Sybil Joe. It's really been a pleasure to have you on WLRN. We will link definitely to Red Light Exposé and the paper that you wrote, and probably some of those other organizations that you mentioned, Andrea, so that our listeners can find out more about how to get involved and support the women who are exiting, and also bring awareness to the men. Thank you for your time. Thank you for all of your work and your bravery. Thank you to our listeners as well.
Hi, I'm Joni, one of Wolf's RadFem summer camp counselors, and I'd like to invite you to a women-only Week in the Woods of the Pacific Northwest, June 24th through 30th, featuring radical feminist history and theory, political strategy and organizing skills, along with gentle hikes, free time for making friends, fun and games, arts and crafts, and some very yummy food. You can find all the details at womensliberationfront.org under the Getting Involved tab. If you love the idea of RadFem Summer Camp and want to support camp and the women attending, we welcome and appreciate your donations. Our website is womensliberationfront.org/2025-summer-camps. We hope to see you there.
Since 2016,
empowering women to be the media
and reclaim the narrative.
Your grassroots community radio station.
By women, for women.
WLRN.
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 I want to talk about porn and prostitution from a different angle than the one we radical feminists typically take. I want to talk about sex and female sexuality specifically. I think too often when feminists critique porn and prostitution, they disconnect these two industries and the female experience within them from female sexuality categorically, and this does us all a disservice. We spend a lot of time talking about what sex should not be in the female experience, and very little time thinking about and discussing what sex should be like for us. Liberal women made an attempt at figuring that out when they branched off from radical feminism, but they ultimately got swallowed up by the liberal male sexual agenda, falling for the con that the only way to escape and contradict right-wing control of female sexuality was to flee into the equally sick and misogynistic left-wing control of female sexuality. So let's start with basic facts. Women are sexual beings. We have sex drives. We are capable of sexual pleasure. Most women want to experience sexual pleasure. These statements have always been factual and always will be. It's also a fact that female sexuality has been indescribably disfigured for all of human history on a global scale by and for males, such that it feels almost impossible to disentangle our sexuality from all the heteropatriarchal misogyny projected onto our bodies and ourselves. That's why most women get lost in the conservative versus liberal scam on the subject of sex. None of us have any idea what female sexuality would actually look like and feel like in a reality without male sexual violence and predation and male control of both the female body and the cultural image of female sexuality. No generation of women anywhere has ever known that, and we will never know. But if we don't consider what sex should be like for us, if we don't try to determine who we can and should be as sexual beings free of patriarchy and misogyny and the sexual projections of men, then we have nothing to work toward as individuals or as a feminist movement on the subject of sex. It's not enough to identify and critique what kind of sex women and girls should never endure, how our sexuality should not be depicted, controlled, shaped, sold, and weaponized. We have to imagine what we want and who we could be if we weren't sexually objectified by men from birth to death. In my opinion, sex can and should be an expression of genuine love, care, and emotional intimacy between a woman and her partner. Sex should leave women feeling loved, cared for, valued, nurtured, connected, wanted as unique individual human beings and not just as a means to an orgasm. Women should feel genuinely safe in every moment of a sexual encounter, physically, emotionally, and mentally. Women should only have sex that feels comfortable, tender, sweet, fun, and joyful. I'm not passing judgment on women who have casual sex or taking a hard stand against it, but I do believe that women and teen girls should only share their sexuality with people who care about them, value them as people, and who can be trusted to respect their bodies, their feelings, and their psyches. And as far as how we express our sexuality, I think women should be able to pursue and act on their natural, genuine desires. I think in a female existence free of patriarchy and misogyny, we are sexual beings who are mentally, emotionally, and spiritually aligned with our bodies. And our sexuality flows in harmony and cohesion with every other part of us. Even if that isn't entirely possible for us in patriarchy, I think that's the goal we're striving for. I think the best, healthiest sexual experience we as women can have would ultimately feel like an act of loving ourselves through and with another person. It would feel like sex is something we do to connect with others and to express ourselves, not something we're being used for or something we ourselves use to get other things we want or need. It would feel like sex is one part of us, not the sum total of our social value. It would feel like a joy every time, not a chore or an obligation. Now think about the female experience in porn and prostitution compared to the ideal I just described. Radical feminists describe porn and prostitution as objectifying, dehumanizing, exploitative, and misogynistic all the time. But what does that actually mean? What do those words really mean in this context? The answer lies in how men and boys see those women and girls, which translates to how said men and boys treat and talk to and talk about the women and girls. Porn and prostitution, like rape itself, cuts love and care and connection out of sex. These industries reduce women and girls to bodies males can use for sexual gratification without knowing or caring who the women and girls are as people, without acknowledging or caring about the emotions and psychological experience of those women and girls. To the pimp and John and pornographer and the man or boy masturbating to the porn, the woman or girl in question isn't a person. Because she's not a person, she doesn't exist or matter beyond the time it takes to film the scene or watch the scene or service the client. Everything that makes her who she is as a unique, irreplaceable person, all the details that a loving friend or spouse would value and all of her emotions and desires and needs they would consider and care about, doesn't matter and doesn't even exist to those males. When we call porn and prostitution misogynistic, remember how literal that statement is. Witness the sheer hatred that men and boys demonstrate toward the women and girls they use in porn and prostitution. There isn't one iota of love, respect, care, or concern in these males for the women and girls they consume. They talk to and about those women and girls with violent derision. They laugh at and get aroused by the physical and psychological suffering and humiliation of the women and girls. They unleash all of their physical and verbal abuse onto prostituted women and girls because they know their wives and girlfriends wouldn't tolerate it. They don't care if the women and girls in porn and prostitution are physically injured, in pain, afraid, or in tears. Some of these men and boys actually enjoy all of the above. You only enjoy the pain and fear of people you hate. It isn't possible to love and care about someone while simultaneously inflicting pain and fear on her. It isn't possible to love and care about a woman or a girl and feel either indifferent to or excited by her pain and fear. Let's set aside the small minority of women who swear they chose to enter porn or prostitution out of genuine interest, enjoyed their experience, and suffered no emotional or psychological consequences. For the overwhelming majority of women, many of whom first enter these industries as teen girls, porn and prostitution affect the body, heart, and psyche in the same ways that rape and other forms of sexual assault do. Porn and prostitution traumatize the women and girls who participate in them. Trauma lives in the body, sometimes for life, and can have both long-term psychological and physical effects if not healed. I think we as feminists don't emphasize the significance of female trauma enough, especially when we talk about women and girls in porn and prostitution. Trauma changes you as a person forever, even if you manage to recover and heal from it. It can affect your physical health for the rest of your life, even to the point of creating terminal illness or chronic illness. It changes your ability to develop and maintain happy, healthy relationships with people, romantic and platonic. And even if you manage to heal your trauma, that process takes a lot of time, hard work, and money, and is usually an emotionally and mentally harrowing, exhausting experience in itself. If one rape can traumatize a woman or a girl for years, decades, the rest of her life, how much more does even a short period of porn or prostitution traumatize a woman or a girl? Sex can be the most emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, and physically intimate experience shared between two people. It can be a way of accessing love and connection at a level of intensity and depth otherwise inaccessible. It can be a way to express your love, appreciation, care, and desire for another person with the most amount of feeling possible. Which is why the ugliness and the cruelty of porn and prostitution should be literally horrifying and repulsive to us. The contrast, the gap between genuinely loving sex and the porn and prostitution industries is starker than we feminists even consciously grasp or acknowledge. The way men talk to and about women and girls in these industries alone should disqualify them from romantic relationships with women for life. Never mind the males who actually work in the porn industry or who traffic, pimp, and buy prostituted women and girls. Radical feminism professes that no woman or girl deserves to be sexually traumatized or violated for any reason ever, and recognizes that sexual violence committed against females by males is both a tool and a goal of patriarchy. We point this out so much that it's easy for us to gloss over the real consequences of this trauma and violence in women's lives, in girls' lives. And when we talk about porn and prostitution, we tend to lose sight of all the love and care and kindness that those women and girls are not experiencing in sex, getting caught up in big political words like commodification and objectification and even misogyny. You don't have to be an ex-porn actress or former prostitute to be a woman who's survived male sexual violence or who has never experienced loving, caring, kind sex with a partner who values you as a person. But it's the women and girls in porn and prostitution who show us just how mean and nasty and sadistic and ultimately devoid of any ability to recognize female humanity so many males are. Let porn and prostitution show you everything that sex should never be. What you as a woman should never tolerate in sex. Let porn and prostitution remind you of what patriarchy is really about for men. Let porn and prostitution motivate you to choose solidarity with all women over loyalty to males who would commit the sexual violence of those industries against women and girls, then laugh about it, profit off it, and bond with each other over it.
Thanks for listening to WLRN's 109th edition podcast on commercial sexual exploitation. WLRN would like to thank our guests this month for sharing their views on and personal experiences of prostitution. Thank you so much, Andrea and Sybil Joe, for speaking with me. These two women are boldly speaking out and sharing not only the horrors of commercial sexual exploitation and the damage it causes, but their understandings of how prostitution fits into our overwhelmingly misogynistic societies. You can learn more from Andrea, Sybil Joe, and other women who have exited prostitution on their podcast, Red Light Exposé, at redlightexposé.com. Until next time, this is Freda signing off on another WLRN podcast.
For edition 109, Prostitution and Pornography, we heard Freda interview Andrea Heinz and Sybil Joe of Red Light Exposé, a podcast critical of the sex trade. I used some imagery from the Red Light Exposé Facebook page and combined that with an image of a woman and some Procreate textures. The defiant silhouette of a woman from Red Light Exposé, along with the words critical voice, overlaps the word exposé and the image of the woman. The textures I added, including drops and splatters, and a sort of cross-hatching, are intended to suggest injuries, which could be visible or hidden, the sort of trauma that Sekhmet SheOwl describes in her commentary. Thanks for listening to the women's voices of WLRN. This is Margaret, signing off for now.
And I am Thistle Pedersen. Thanks for tuning in. Happy 9-year anniversary to WLRN. Woohoo! Next month, we'll focus our program on the legal issues surrounding commercial sex exploitation with Diane Post. Our handcrafted podcasts always come out the first Thursday of the month, so look for it on Thursday, June 5th. If you'd like to receive our newsletter that notifies you when each podcast, article, and interview are released, please sign up for our newsletter at WLRNmedia.com. Stay strong in the struggle, and thanks for listening.
This is Mary, signing off on another edition of WLRN's monthly handcrafted podcast. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Spinster, and SoundCloud, in addition to our WordPress site. Thanks for listening.
And this is Aurora. Before I sign off, I wanted to mention that I will be doing WDI's Radical Feminist Perspectives this Sunday, May 4th. It is very early for the live stream in the United States. It'll be 5 a.m. here on the East Coast, but you can always catch the video later. Susan Hawthorne and I will be talking about one of my absolute favorite books, Susan Griffin's Pornography and Silence, Culture's Revenge Against Nature. Here at WLRN, our monthly podcasts are always crafted with tender loving care and in solidarity with women worldwide. Thank you so much for listening and for your support. We would love to hear from you, so please share, like, and comment widely. Thanks again.
But how will we find our way out of this? What is the antidote for the patriarchal kiss? How will we find what needs to be shown? And then after that, where is home?